Hello there and welcome to the Star Wars Showcase YouTube channel. Today we're going to take a step back from our Star Wars focus and talk through some different tips and tricks for making your very own Simon Ghost Riley action figure from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Let's get into it. Now before we get into things like painting and priming, let's talk some parts and pieces, as making your own Ghost action figure is going to require you to track down a few extra things. Now the first thing that we need to do is select our action figure base body that we're going to build things off of. And there's a lot of great options out there. I myself have gone with the Valaverse Action Force. I've got a couple of those pulled up on screen here, but you also might consider using, a G.I. Joe classified action figure. Basically, you just want to find an action figure body that kind of has that military feel to it, and that kind of suits the appearance for Ghost that you want to use. Ghost has a lot of different appearances across all these different Call of Duty games, so there's plenty of different kind of looks that you can try for, but most importantly, just find something that you kind of want to work with, that you can kind of build with, and that really suits your preference. And as a call out, if you're new to action figure customizing as a hobby, getting this base body is typically going to run you around $20 to $25. That's the kind of the retail going price for many of these figures. And as you take off the existing head and strip away the weapons to get, just the base that we're going to be working with, that gives you some extra accessories for a future project down the line. Now the next thing that we're going to need is a 3D printed head sculpt of Ghost himself. And I managed to grab mine off of Etsy. I've got the product listing pulled up here, and these are coming from My Action Figure Lab. So I ordered a couple of things from them in the past. They had, great shipping, good customer service, all of that, and was able to get a pretty good deal on things, all things considered, as oftentimes our 3D printed head sculpts like this can run anywhere from, $7 or $8 all the way up to $14, $15, depending on the complexity of the 3D print. So with those basic things gathered together, we can start our build. A couple of optional things that I'll go over a little bit later in the video, but this is going to be our foundation. So you can see I've got my Valaverse body here, as well as my Ghost head sculpt. And you'll notice that my head sculpt here has already been painted black. And what I've done here, and what you'll need to do anytime you're using a 3D print, is begin things by putting a thin layer of spray-on primer. Primer is going to be our foundational base coat whenever we're painting things. And you may have used this if you've done, furniture painting or outdoor painting projects, but you can kind of loosely understand this as the first foundational layer that you'll put down on a project, which creates a strong base that we can then paint on top of without worrying that the paint is going to go on watery or that it's going to, kind of glop together and get chunky. Basically, by putting down the primer and then doing several thin layers of acrylic paint on top of that, we can get a really nice, really detailed paint job on any 3D printed head sculpt that we're working with. So you can get paint primer for a couple of bucks at any store. I do recommend checking out primers that are actually designed for miniature painting, things like, Warhammer 40K, as that primer is actually going to be a little bit more tailored to capturing the individual details on, very small things, as opposed to automotive primer, which is really there to cover, more ground. So, take your preferred primer of choice, take your project outside, put things on a skewer or a toothpick or something, and just spray paint that on there in some nice thin layers, of course within a well-ventilated space while using proper, face mask protection there. And once things have dried, you're then ready to begin putting your paint on top of this and really beginning the project in earnest. So you can see here, I'm starting with the kind of white skull effect on Ghost's face by just putting on a very thin layer of some watered down white acrylic paint. Now, and a lot of different things there. Let me break that down a little bit more. There's two types of paint that you're often going to see used in miniature painting. There's enamel-based paint and acrylic-based paint. And when we're working on 3D prints like this, you're always going to want to use an acrylic-based paint. And it's going to be very clear when you're buying a product if it's going to be enamel versus acrylic. But what acrylic is going to do is, with those thin layers that I mentioned earlier, so we're not glopping it on, we're not trying to speed paint or get this done as fast as possible, just very thin layers of acrylic paint on top of each other get us a very nice uniform paint job that still captures all of the detail that's underneath within the 3D print itself. Now, I also mentioned that you want to water down your paints a little bit. It can be tempting to just stick, whatever paintbrush you have right into your paint and then just get to work there. But oftentimes these paints are a little bit more on the concentrated side, and what you'll want to do is take a little bit of that paint and either put it on, a palette of some kind, on a paper towel, wherever, and add just a tiny bit of water to it. I'm talking a drop or two, and then mix that in just to dilute things a little bit. Again, by using a little bit of a thinner approach when it comes to our paints, it's going to make for a much more uniform look that goes on much more smoothly, as opposed to kind of the gloppier effect that you might see when you're painting straight out of the bottle. All right, so once we have 2 to 3 thin layers of that white paint capturing Ghost's kind of initial skull face mask there, I also pull out a little bit of a tan color, and I've got my war paint skeleton bone. I really like this coloring, just to color in those straps that are what hold the mask in place. Feel free to use any color you want here. I kind of like the tan kind of desert look, but that's really up to you. Once that tan is in place, we're then going to work to paint in Ghost's jawline. So you can see I've just got that thin white line moving right above his chin. Work to leave a little bit of room between the top set of teeth and the line that you're painting in, as we'll be working with that a bit in a moment. And just for ease of reference, transitioning here to kind of a forward-facing reference, that jawline is going to have a little bit of black between the part that we're painting in as well as the upper skull piece. So make sure that you're just leaving a little bit of space there. Your paint job does not have to be perfect here. This is whatever you feel comfortable with. But just remember, again, we're doing very thin layers of paint here and just working to go nice and slow so that we're not rushing through things and our paint isn't going to glop up. From there, we're going to transition to what might be the most difficult part of this particular project, which is working on Ghost's teeth. And you can notice here in this image as well, we have the individual teeth that are painted in along that bottom jawline. And so for us, we're going to want to get a very fine tip brush, just a tiny bit of watered down paint, and take things nice and slow when working to get those teeth painted in. You can kind of think of this as just doing a lot of really small ovals next to each other. And I've got my examples pulled up here. This took me a lot of trial and error. I made some mistakes, had to go over and kind of repaint some black to get something that I was happy with. So again, just take this nice and easy. We're working to get uniformity here, kind of an equal amount of space in between each tooth. This can be a little bit challenging if you're a beginner painter. I've been doing this a while and I still found it pretty challenging. But just go at your own pace and really get something that you're comfortable with. If you are feeling very confident in your abilities, you can do a whole bunch of teeth there and probably feel really good about the size and shape there. If you're feeling less good, you can go a little bit bigger. Maybe it's going to be less teeth that you're putting in, a little bit bigger, a little bit more detail. It's whatever you're really feeling comfortable with. Once you have your teeth painted on, we get to move to some of the fun stuff, namely our weathering. Ghost is always, fighting and running around, explosions, all that good stuff. And so we need to add a little bit of dirt and grime to really get that authentic feel. So what I'm using on the screen right now is known as a Tamiya Weathering Master. This is a form of kind of dry weathering where we're able to add a little bit more shade and kind of dirty effect to whatever we're painting. And you can think of this as basically like a makeup sponge. You get these little palettes here, and there's going to be a little sponge applicator that it comes with, and you're just going to take that sponge and kind of dip it and move it around in whatever your preferred kind of weathering look is. So you can see I'm really just going over the entire head sculpt here with a little bit of that sandier look. I wanted to get kind of a desert feel to my particular Ghost here. And when you pull things up and compare them to an unweathered model, you'll see that there is a big difference here. And this is a great way, this dry weathering, to add just kind of that subtle, kind of dusty and worn effect in a couple of very easy steps. Once you have that initial layer of weathering done, make sure to go back and paint in those white stripes you see over Ghost's eyes in this image here. I wanted to do the layer of weathering first, so when we double back on that white stripe, it's much more pronounced against the other white that we put on in that original base layer. Our next big step here in terms of assembly is going to be taking our now painted 3D head sculpt and affixing it to our selected base body. And I've promised this in some past videos, but I'm going to be showcasing for you how to do this with a little bit of Vaseline as well as hot glue. And what this kind of technique allows us to do is basically glue a head sculpt into place on top of an action figure while still maintaining articulation and the ability to move that head on a swivel up and down and side to side. So, what we're going to do is first take our base action figure body, which is going to have that little ball joint, that kind of nub at the very top of his neck that the head is going to fit on top of. And what we're going to do is to dip that joint within Vaseline, kind of create a nice layer around that. And this is just your average store-bought Vaseline. You can get it at any pharmacy, any big box store. And what we'll then do with our 3D printed head sculpt is fill that up about I'd say 60 to 75% of the way with hot glue. In one fluid motion, we're then going to take the head sculpt filled with glue and put that right on top of the kind of Vaseline greased joint. And before things dry, we're going to work to just gently move things from side to side. And what's happening when we do this is your hot glue is going to dry very quickly, but it won't adhere to the Vaseline that we've added. And so what's happening is we're moving things around is the hot glue is actually going to dry around the Vaseline and basically create a seal so that the head sculpt stays in place, but we're still able to move it around and have articulation. You'll need to act quickly when doing this step because, again, that hot glue is going to dry very quickly. So if you put that glue in there and wait a minute, then you've just plugged up your head sculpt and you'll have to scrape things out. So make sure that when you're doing this step that you've kind of got everything, all arranged in your mind what you need to do, is it basically needs to be done all in one motion. Now, alternatively, if this kind of step is something that you're not comfortable with or if you don't have the materials for, you can also just take a little bit of putty, put that inside the head sculpt, and then stick the joint right on top of things. That basically simulates the same effect, albeit without the same kind of leverage keeping everything in place. Now, once your head sculpt has been affixed according to whatever your preferred technique is, we then move into some of the optional steps for our ghost build. And one that I wanted to try out here was the use of soft goods. In many of our ghost appearances, he's often wearing a scarf or a shemagh, which is a traditional Middle Eastern form of kind of headdress/scarf. Now, I've taken a very basic approach to this. I don't have a lot of experience in sewing or working with textiles and fabrics. And what I ended up actually doing is just heading down to Walmart and buying a very cheap bolt of gray fabric. Couple of bucks for like a yard of this stuff. And what I've basically done is try to measure this out as if this were to scale a real human being. And so because we are working on a 6-inch project here, I assume that, okay, if this is a 6-foot tall person, we're then going to want to expand our dimensions basically by a factor of 12. Which would give us roughly the equivalent size if I were to actually be wearing one of these shemaghs myself. So after a little bit of research on sizing and dimensions here, I cut out between a 5 and 6-inch square of fabric. And I actually took some measures to make sure that my cutting wasn't uniform all the way around. We don't want a perfect square with right angles because you don't wear a scarf with perfectly square right angles. So don't be afraid to get a little bit of some jagged cutting in there, maybe even a little bit of tearing to simulate a little bit more of that real fabric feel. And once I had that fabric all cut out to the dimensions I liked, I did something called distressing. And this is actually something you'll see people who do professional cosplay do a lot, is you don't have a scarf or a shirt that is perfectly brand new if you are dressing up like a character who's kind of been through the ringer, or like Ghost is, fighting and in a combat zone. And so what I did first is actually just crumble up my fabric into a ball a whole bunch of times. I wanted to get different creases, I wanted to get a little bit of wear to that. And once I had done that a couple of times, I actually took a piece of sandpaper, just went outside, placed the fabric on the ground, and then scuffed that fabric up a whole bunch on both sides with that sandpaper. And what that does is add a lot more wear, it adds some of that additional weathering, as well as some tiny little kind of tears and rips along the edges to really give this more authentic looking piece of fabric than just one that has been cut straight from the bolt that you bought. So after beating things up a little bit, you've got a nice little square of really distressed, really weathered fabric that we can then tie into kind of a bandana or like a neckerchief or a shemagh, to any kind of pattern that you want to fit on your figure. So it feels a little bit funny, but I actually just went online and typed in how to tie a shemagh and found the basic WikiHow article with a couple of GIFs and instructions to walk you through things, and really just tried to follow a couple of the different styles here as best I could. As you're working with this fabric and as you tie the knots in the back, you might have a little bit of excess, so you might need to take some scissors, kind of trim that up, try to get it to look nice with the knot all tied. But this really is whatever you'd like. If you want to do a bigger scarf, if you want to do something over the top of the head, whatever your preference is, you can kind of play around with this. And once that's all complete, you really have a battle-ready Ghost action figure ready to go on your desk or your shelf or within your toy photography or wherever else. As you can see here, I was making multiple of these at the same time, each with kind of a unique style. So I've got some different kinds of kind of wraps as well as scarves, and then a different selection of weapons as well to kind of accompany that. As far as weapons go, you can choose really whatever you'd like, whatever you have lying around, or try to see if there's other 3D printed options, as there's plenty of them out there. The ones on the screen right now are from some other Action Force figures, but I also played around and used some of these guns from Gridiron Studios. They're a fantastic Arizona-based 3D printing company that does all of these kinds of things. I've bought from them a lot in the past, and they look really good here, so find whatever suits you as well as the figure that you've made the very best. So that pretty much wraps it up in terms of the different steps, different tips and tricks for making your own action figure Ghost. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below if you've got any recommendations or adjustments on strategy here. And make sure to also check out my eBay storefront, which is listed down in the video description below, as I'll actually be listing a couple of these figures for sale if you'd like to purchase one. That all said, I appreciate you watching here. Please like and subscribe, as that really helps grow the channel. And appearing on your screen as well is going to be some of the other content that I've done here, other action figure tutorials for more Star Wars-based projects, as well as different reviews and retrospectives for recent Star Wars releases and news.